There are some horror games you play once and move on from. Games that give you their scares, their story beats, their moments of dread, and then release you back into the world unchanged. Silent Hill is not one of those games. This is a series that gets under your skin, that follows you into the quiet moments when you're alone with your thoughts, that reshapes how you understand what horror can be. And yet, for all the praise this series receives, for its fog, for its monsters, for its soundtracks, there are layers of brilliance that rarely get discussed. Design choices so subtle they're easy to miss, mechanical decisions that shape survival horror forever, atmospheric techniques that influence an entire generation of developers. Tonight, we're going deeper than the surface. We're exploring the parts of Silent Hill that deserve recognition but somehow slip through conversations. The elements that make this series not just memorable, but genuinely transformative. Before we start, hit that like button to help other fans discover this video, and drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far a video can reach in the world. So now let's begin. The architecture of dread. Most discussions about Silent Hill begin and end with the fog. It's the series' signature, the visual shorthand that instantly communicates which world you've entered. But the fog was never just about aesthetics. It was born from limitation, from the PlayStation's inability to render full city blocks without the frame rate collapsing into a slideshow. Team Silent faced a technical wall, and instead of compromising their vision of an explorable town, they wrapped that limitation in gray-white mist and discovered something profound. Uncertainty is more frightening than visibility. The genius wasn't just hiding the draw distance, it was understanding what that hiding does to the human mind. Our brains are pattern recognition machines, constantly scanning environments for threats, for familiar shapes, for information that helps us navigate safely through space. When you remove clear visual information, the brain doesn't simply accept the void. It fills gaps. It hallucinates possibilities. Every shadow becomes movement. Every distant shape becomes threat. The fog in Silent Hill weaponizes this neurological quirk, turning the player's own perception into an unreliable narrator. But here's what rarely gets discussed. The fog fundamentally changes how you navigate space, and in doing so, it creates a unique spatial relationship between player and environment that almost no other game has replicated. In most survival horror, you move through discrete rooms. Resident Evil perfected this. Pre-rendered backgrounds showing you clear, bounded spaces. You enter a room, assess threats, manage resources, solve puzzles, and move to the next chamber. The architecture is legible. The camera shows you what matters. But Silent Hill's fog means you're never moving through rooms. You're moving through suggestions of space. That building emerges from white nothingness as you approach, gains definition, becomes solid, then fades back into obscurity as you pass. Landmarks exist in temporal sequence rather than spatial permanence. You can't see the church from the hospital. You can't orient yourself by distant points. Every location exists only in relation to where you are right now, and the moment you move forward, everything behind you ceases to visually exist. This creates navigation as an act of faith. In other games, you can survey an area, plan your route, execute your strategy. Silent Hill demands you walk into uncertainty with incomplete information, trusting that the street continues beyond the visible edge, that the turn you remember is actually where you think it is, that the map you're consulting matches the reality obscured by mist. And here's the subtle brilliance: this mirrors the psychological state of the protagonist. Harry Mason isn't a trained operative moving through hostile territory with tactical awareness. He's a panicked father stumbling through a nightmare, grasping at any landmark that might lead him to his daughter. James Sunderland isn't surveying his environment with strategic precision. He's wading through his own guilt made manifest, moving forward because stopping means confronting what he's running from. The limited visibility isn't just atmosphere, it's characterization through mechanics. You feel lost because they are lost. You feel uncertain because they are uncertain. The fog doesn't just hide technical limitations, it creates perfect mechanical sympathy between player and character. Consider how this changes the experience of encountering enemies. In Resident Evil, zombies appear in rooms, and the fixed camera might hide them around corners for jump scares, but fundamentally you can see the threat, assess it, decide whether to fight or conserve resources. The tension comes from resource management and pattern recognition. In Silent Hill, the radio crackles with static, warning you something is near, but the fog means you often can't locate the threat until it's dangerously close. You stop walking. You strain to see movement in the white. You hear something, footsteps, a guttural sound, something dragging across pavement, but you can't pinpoint the source. The static intensifies. Your visibility remains maybe 20 feet. Do you advance? Do you retreat? Do you ready a weapon when you can't even confirm what you're fighting? This isn't resource tension. This is existential tension. The horror comes not from scarcity, but from the fundamental uncertainty of what's happening around you. What's remarkable is how Team Silent doubled down on this philosophy in subsequent games, even when hardware limitations disappeared. Silent Hill 2 on PlayStation 2 could have rendered entire blocks clearly. Silent Hill 3 could have given you clean sight lines through the mall, the hospital, the church, but they kept the fog because by then they understood what it provided. Not just a visual signature, but a psychological framework. The fog had evolved from technical necessity to artistic choice, from limitation to identity. And in keeping it, they demonstrated something crucial about game design that few developers truly grasp. Sometimes what you can't show is more important than what you can. The fog also does something subtle to pacing that deserves recognition. In most horror games, tension follows a rhythm: build up, scare, relief, build up, scare, relief. You learn the pattern. You anticipate when the game will try to frighten you. But consistent limited visibility means Silent Hill can maintain baseline unease without relying on scripted moments. The fog is always there, always restricting information, always making every forward step uncertain. This creates a kind of ambient dread that doesn't spike and valley but maintains constant low-level anxiety. You're never quite relaxed because you're never quite sure what's beyond the visible edge. And when the game does introduce specific scares, a creature lunging from the mist, a siren wailing as the world transitions to the other world, those moments hit harder because they puncture sustained tension rather than interrupting temporary calm. The influence of this design philosophy ripples through horror gaming history in ways that often go unacknowledged. Bloodborne streets use similar principles, restricting sight lines through architecture and environmental design to create uncertainty about what waits around corners. Alan Wake built entire gameplay systems around limited visibility, using darkness and a flashlight to control what players can perceive. Dead spaces, narrow corridors, and strategic lighting create zones of uncertainty within the structured environment of a space station. Even non-horror games borrowed the lesson. Journey uses distance fog to hide the mountain peak you're traveling toward, maintaining mystery about your destination. The Soul series uses it extensively to mask level boundaries and create atmosphere. But in 1999, when Silent Hill released, this approach was radical. This was horror, through strategic absence rather than calculated presence, through what you couldn't see rather than what you could. The language of rust. When the air raid siren wails and the world shifts to the other world, something happens that transcends simple environmental transformation. The rust that consumes every surface, the chain link fencing that appears inexplicably, the blood that seeps through walls and floors. This isn't arbitrary nightmare imagery. It's a visual language that communicates psychological state through architectural decay, and the sophistication of this system rarely receives proper analysis. Let's start with rust itself. On a literal level, rust represents corrosion, the slow destruction of metal through oxidation, the inevitable decay that occurs when protective layers fail and exposure takes its toll. But Silent Hill uses rust symbolically in ways that connect directly to the psychological states of its protagonists. Rust is neglect made visible. It's the physical manifestation of things left unattended, of maintenance deferred, of protection abandoned. When Harry's world transforms and rust consumes the hospital, the school, the streets, we're seeing neglect literalized, the town showing him what happens when you fail to protect what matters. When James walks through rusted corridors in Brookhaven Hospital, he's moving through the physical embodiment of his guilt, through spaces that reflect how he let Mary corrode, how he failed to maintain his duty as her husband when her illness made her difficult, when caring for her became burden rather than love. The chain link fencing that appears throughout otherworld sequences serves similar symbolic purpose. Chain link is industrial, cheap, utilitarian, the kind of barrier that marks abandoned lots, restricts access to dangerous areas, separates the maintained world from spaces deemed unworthy of attention. It's also transparent. You can see through it but cannot pass. It creates visible barriers that emphasize restriction and entrapment. The chain link in Silent Hill manifests as both architectural element and symbolic cage, showing protagonists that they can see truths they're not ready to face, that they can perceive what they cannot yet access, that understanding and acceptance remain separated by barriers they must eventually breach. Blood is perhaps the most obvious symbolic element, but its use in Silent Hill operates on multiple registers that deserve examination. Yes, blood signifies violence, suffering, mortality, but in the other world, blood doesn't just pool where bodies might have fallen. It flows impossibly upward along walls. It seeps through floors without source. It stains surfaces without following physical rules. This isn't evidence of violence. It's violence made environmental. Suffering so pervasive it becomes architectural feature rather than isolated incident. When you walk through blood-soaked corridors in Alchemilla Hospital, you're not seeing evidence of injuries. You're inside the injury itself, moving through spaces where trauma has become geography. What makes this visual language especially sophisticated is how Team Silent deploys it with restraint. The other world doesn't appear constantly. Long stretches of gameplay occur in the fog world. Unsettling, yes, but recognizably the abandoned version of a real town. This makes the transitions to Otherworld hit with genuine impact. The world doesn't just get darker or more dangerous. It transforms into something fundamentally wrong, into geometry that shouldn't exist, into spaces where architectural logic fails. Classrooms become prison cells. Hospital corridors become organic tunnels. Church sanctuaries become execution chambers. These aren't just scary versions of normal spaces. They're revelations of what these places mean to the protagonist, of what associations and traumas have become attached to otherwise neutral locations. The architectural impossibility of otherworld spaces reinforces this psychological reading. In the fog world, Silent Hill's geography is strange but navigable. Buildings connect in unusual ways. Shortcuts loop back to familiar areas, but fundamentally you can map the space, can understand where you are in relation to where you've been. The other world abandons this logic. Rooms connect in sequences that couldn't physically exist. You descend staircases that should take you below street level, but instead emerge onto higher floors. Corridors bend in directions that violate Euclidean geometry. This isn't the game being careless with level design. It's demonstrating that you've left physical space and entered psychological space, where connections follow emotional logic rather than architectural rules, where proximity is determined by association rather than distance. Silent Hill 2 perfected this system. Brookhaven Hospital's Otherworld transformation remains one of the most sophisticated examples of environmental storytelling in gaming. The standard hospital is already unsettling, abandoned, decaying, filled with monstrous nurses that reflect James's conflicted feelings about caregivers. But when it shifts to Otherworld, specific rooms transform in ways that directly comment on James's relationship with Mary's illness. The patient rooms become prison cells with beds replaced by torture devices, showing how James came to view Mary's illness as imprisonment for both of them. The elevators cage traps rather than transportation, reflecting James's feeling that there was no way out of their situation, no escape from the decline. The basement transforms into an organic nightmare of flesh walls and bleeding surfaces, visualizing James's revulsion toward Mary's bodily deterioration, his inability to separate the woman he loved from the disease consuming her. The visual language extends beyond architecture to color palette. The other world consistently employs reds, rusts, dark greens, and sickly yellows, the colors of disease, of bodily corruption, of infection and decay. These aren't random choices. They're the palette of illness, of hospitals, of the physical breakdown James witnessed during Mary's decline. Every visual choice reinforces the psychological reality being portrayed. Even the lighting changes meaning. The fog world uses primarily gray tones with occasional streetlights, creating small pools of yellow illumination, limited but present light suggesting obscured truth, information that exists but remains difficult to perceive. The other world eliminates consistent light sources, instead using flickering bulbs, fires without clear origin, and bioluminescent surfaces that glow with quasi-organic light, illumination that reveals but doesn't clarify, that shows horror without offering understanding. What rarely gets acknowledged is how this visual system trained players to read environmental storytelling in ways that influence game design broadly. Before Silent Hill, horror games used environments primarily as set dressing, as spaces that looked appropriately spooky, but didn't communicate specific meaning beyond "this place is dangerous." Silent Hill demonstrated that environment could serve as externalized psychology, that spaces could tell stories more sophisticated than dialogue, that architecture itself could function as character development. BioShock's Rapture owes tremendous debt to this approach, using architectural decay and environmental details to communicate the fall of objectivist ideals. The Last of Us employs environmental storytelling extensively, showing societal collapse through specific arrangements of objects, through notes and belongings that tell micro-stories. Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice uses environmental distortion to represent psychosis, but Silent Hill pioneered this technique in horror gaming, proving that space itself could be narrative device. The rust, the chain link, the blood, the impossible geometry, all of it serves a singular purpose, making internal states external, rendering the invisible visible, giving physical form to psychological torment. This is why the other world feels genuinely disturbing rather than merely grotesque. It's not showing you random nightmare imagery, it's showing you specific nightmares, personalized hells crafted from the fears and guilts of particular individuals. And in doing so, it creates horror that resonates differently for each person experiencing it, because we all bring our own failures and fears to these rusty corridors, and we all see something of ourselves reflected in the blood that runs up walls and the chains that bar our passage. The weight of helplessness. Combat in survival horror typically follows a clear progression. You start weak, learn the systems, become competent, and eventually master the mechanics. By the end of Resident Evil, skilled players can navigate the mansion without taking damage, can perfectly time knife strikes and grenade throws, can execute efficient routes that minimize resource consumption. Mastery is possible and encouraged. Silent Hill rejects this philosophy entirely. You begin the game bad at fighting, and you stay bad at fighting. Harry Mason swings his steel pipe like a man who's never held a weapon before, because he hasn't. The wind-up is slow, the recovery is uncertain, the hitboxes feel unreliable. When he fires a gun, his aim wavers, even when your targeting is perfect, because Harry isn't a marksman. He's a writer in his late 30s whose primary physical activity is probably gardening. This mechanical clumsiness isn't a flaw. It's the most important design decision Team Silent made. Let's examine what this does psychologically. In games, we generally expect to improve through play. We learn attack patterns, we upgrade our abilities, we become more efficient. This creates a power curve where initial vulnerability gives way to eventual competence. It's fundamentally empowering, which makes sense for action games, adventure games, even most horror games. But Silent Hill understood something crucial. Empowerment diminishes fear. The more capable you feel, the less threatened you are. If you can reliably kill every monster you encounter, those monsters become obstacles rather than threats, puzzles to solve rather than dangers to fear. By making Harry perpetually bad at combat, by ensuring you never quite feel in control of violent encounters, the game maintains vulnerability throughout. You never graduate from being afraid. Consider Harry's melee combat animations. When he swings the pipe, there's a long wind-up where he pulls back, a moment of commitment where you're locked into the animation, then the swing itself, followed by recovery time where Harry is essentially defenseless. Compare this to something like Devil May Cry, released just 2 years later, where combat is fluid, responsive, comboable. Dante moves like a trained fighter because that's who he is. Harry moves like someone who doesn't want to be doing this, who is mechanically executing violent motions without comfort or skill. Every swing feels like a risk because it is a risk. You're committing to an animation that might miss, that leaves you exposed, that might connect but not kill, forcing you into another risky exchange. The gunplay reinforces this vulnerability in different ways. Ammunition is scarce enough that using firearms feels expensive, but more importantly, Harry's accuracy is variable. Even when you line up a shot perfectly, Harry might miss. The reticle indicates where he's roughly aiming, but there's spread, there's variance because he's an amateur holding a weapon with nervous hands. This is mechanically frustrating if you come to Silent Hill expecting Resident Evil's combat systems. In Capcom's games, once you learn enemy patterns and weapon behaviors, you can execute clean kills reliably. Zombies require specific shot placement. Hunters have exploitable weaknesses. The game rewards pattern recognition and execution. Silent Hill doesn't reward these skills the same way. You can know exactly how to fight a groaner, maintain distance, wait for it to commit to an attack, shoot during recovery, but execution remains uncertain because Harry's incompetence is baked into the mechanics. This creates a fascinating dynamic where the optimal strategy often becomes avoidance. Why fight if fighting is uncertain, costly, and dangerous? Why not just run past enemies when possible? But the game doesn't explicitly teach you this. Players trained on other survival horror games try to clear areas, try to fight everything, try to improve at combat, and find themselves constantly struggling, constantly low on resources, constantly taking damage. The frustration this creates is intentional. The game wants you to feel like fighting is a bad option, wants you to feel like you're not equipped for this, wants you to question whether engaging with enemies is worth the cost. This shifts the mental framing from how do I kill this efficiently to do I need to kill this at all, from combat as core gameplay to combat as last resort. What's brilliant is how this mechanical vulnerability mirrors thematic vulnerability. Harry is searching for his daughter in an inexplicable nightmare. He doesn't understand what's happening, doesn't know why these creatures exist, doesn't have training or preparation for any of this. His mechanical incompetence with weapons perfectly reflects his narrative incompetence in this situation. He is out of his depth in every possible way, and the gameplay makes you feel that constantly. You never get the power fantasy of becoming capable. You remain vulnerable and uncertain throughout. Silent Hill 2 takes this philosophy even further with James Sunderland. His combat animations are somehow even more exhausted and depressive than Harry's. When James swings a wooden plank, it looks like an action requiring tremendous effort, like he's moving through water or carrying extra weight. His gunshots feel desperate rather than purposeful. His recovery animations show a man who doesn't care if he gets hurt, who might even want to get hurt, because emotionally that's exactly who James is. He's not fighting to survive. He's fighting because he's not ready to stop, because confronting these monsters is easier than confronting his own actions. The mechanical feel of controlling James communicates his psychological state more effectively than any dialogue could. You don't just hear that James is depressed and guilt-ridden. You feel it in how he moves, how he fights, how every action seems to require forcing himself forward against tremendous internal resistance. This design philosophy was radical in 1999 and remains unusual even now. Most games strive to make players feel powerful, capable, improving. That's core to why we play games, to be effective in ways we're not in real life, to master systems, to experience competence. Silent Hill deliberately withholds this satisfaction. It makes you feel uncertain and ill-equipped throughout, and discovers that uncertainty is its own form of engagement. You're not playing to master a combat system. You're playing to survive situations you're fundamentally unprepared for, and that lack of preparation is the entire point. The influence of this approach can be traced through horror gaming history. Fatal Frame made cameras your weapon, requiring vulnerability. You had to let ghosts get close to photograph them effectively, creating mechanical tension through forced proximity to threats. Amnesia, The Dark Descent, removed combat entirely, taking Silent Hill's vulnerability logic to its extreme. Alien, Isolation gave you tools but made combat with the xenomorph essentially unwinnable, forcing stealth and avoidance. These games understood what Silent Hill taught. Weakness can be engaging design, helplessness can be gameplay, vulnerability can be the foundation of horror. But at the time of Silent Hill's release, this was revolutionary. This was survival horror that made you bad at surviving, that denied you the power curve, that kept you afraid from beginning to end through mechanical incompetence rather than just resource scarcity or enemy difficulty. The radio that shouldn't work. The pocket radio Harry finds in the cafe early in Silent Hill is such an iconic element that it appears in nearly every subsequent game in the series, with minor aesthetic variations. That crackling static warning of nearby monsters has become as synonymous with Silent Hill as the fog itself. But the radio is doing something mechanically and psychologically sophisticated that rarely receives proper analysis. It's not just an enemy proximity detector, it's a tool that manipulates anticipation, that creates dread in negative space, that transforms silence into threat. Let's start with the mechanical purpose. Silent Hill's fog and fixed camera angles meant you often couldn't see enemies until they were dangerously close. Without some warning system, encounters would feel random and punishing, taking damage from something you had no way of anticipating, dying to threats you couldn't perceive. The radio solves this problem elegantly. Static begins when you're near enemies, intensifying as proximity decreases. This gives you information the visual field can't provide, lets you know danger is present even when you can't pinpoint location. Mechanically, it's solving a design problem created by limited visibility. But here's where it becomes brilliant. The radio doesn't tell you where the enemy is, only that something is near. The static spikes. You stop walking, you listen, footsteps, breathing. You strain to see movement in the fog. Nothing. But the radio insists threat is present. Do you advance cautiously? Do you ready a weapon? Do you retreat and find another route? The uncertainty the radio creates is more effective than precise information would be. If it beeped louder when you faced the right direction, if it gave you clear data about enemy location, it would reduce tension by providing actionable intelligence. Instead, it provides anxiety. You know danger exists nearby, but not where, not what kind, not how many. Your imagination fills the gap, and imagination is always more frightening than specificity. The genius escalates when you realize the radio is manipulating anticipation in time as well as space. The static crackles, threat is near, but sometimes you walk through entire areas with the static going, never seeing an enemy, never encountering anything. Was something there that you missed? Did it move away? Is the radio malfunctioning? Other times the static spikes, and a creature lunges from the fog immediately. The inconsistency is crucial. If the radio always meant immediate combat, you'd learn to associate static with engagement, would prepare accordingly, would develop reliable responses. Instead, the timing varies. Sometimes threat is imminent, sometimes threat is potential. Sometimes you're walking through danger zones without incident, and the only evidence of that danger is audio. This variability means you can never relax when the radio is active. Every moment of static might precede combat, or might fade back to silence, and you have no way of knowing which until it resolves. Consider what this does to the player's relationship with silence. In most games, silence is neutral or even comforting. It means you're safe, nothing is happening, you can relax slightly. In Silent Hill, silence becomes precious. When the radio goes quiet, you know you're temporarily away from threats. That silence is relief, but it also becomes anticipatory. How long until the static returns? When will the next warning come? You start to dread the sound of the radio crackling to life, start to flinch when static interrupts quiet moments. The radio transforms silence from neutral absence of sound into active presence of safety, making the return of static that much more impactful. The radio also creates an interesting dynamic with player attention. When walking through fog with the radio quiet, you're scanning visually, looking for landmarks, trying to navigate. But the moment static begins, attention shifts. You're now listening carefully, trying to detect enemy sounds beneath the static, watching for movement with heightened focus. The radio literally changes what sensory information you prioritize, shifts you from visual navigation mode to multi-sensory threat detection mode. This keeps engagement high even during stretches of gameplay where nothing is happening, because the radio ensures you're never quite sure whether nothing is actually happening or whether danger is present but not yet visible. What's particularly sophisticated is how the radio plays with the psychology of tinnitus and sensory unreliability. Prolonged exposure to the static noise actually makes it harder to distinguish real sounds from artifacts of the static itself. You start hearing things, patterns in the white noise, suggestions of footsteps or breathing that might be enemy audio or might be your brain finding patterns where none exist. This mirrors the experience of being in genuinely frightening situations, where hypervigilance makes you hypersensitive to sensory information, where you start perceiving threats that might not be there. The radio makes you paranoid, makes you second guess your perceptions, makes you uncertain about what's real and what's anxiety. That's not a bug, that's the feature. The lore explanation for the radio varies across games and interpretations. Some sources suggest monsters generate electromagnetic interference. Others frame it as the town itself broadcasting warnings or taunting its victims. But the lack of definitive explanation actually strengthens the device narratively. The radio just works. Harry picks it up, notices it emits static near creatures, and uses it. He doesn't understand why, doesn't waste time questioning the mechanism. This acceptance of inexplicable utility reinforces the dreamlike logic of Silent Hill, where things happen without clear causation, where you use tools that shouldn't function but do. The radio becomes one more element of the town's wrongness, a broken device that works in ways it shouldn't, providing information through means that make no sense, becoming useful precisely because nothing else about this situation makes sense either. The influence of the radio mechanic appears across horror gaming, though rarely duplicated with the same subtlety. Dead Space's motion tracker serves similar purposes, alerting to nearby necromorphs, but it provides more specific directional information, reducing uncertainty. Alien Isolation's motion tracker is closer to Silent Hill's philosophy, showing proximity and general direction but requiring you to stop moving and look away from the game world to check it, creating vulnerability moments. But few games have matched the elegant simplicity of the radio, an always active device that requires no interface, no interaction, just audio warning that something is near. It's pure information delivery that never breaks immersion because it exists diegetically in the world, a physical object Harry carries that players hear as he hears it. The radio also does something subtle to replay value. Once you know where enemies are located, replaying other horror games often reduces tension because you can predict encounters. But the radio's static begins before you see enemies, and the exact positioning of creatures varies slightly between playthroughs. Even when you know generally where threats exist, the radio reestablishes uncertainty on each playthrough by making you experience that anticipatory static before visual confirmation. It keeps the basic function of the warning system effective even when you're familiar with the game's layout and enemy placement. In the Silent Hill 2 remake released in 2024, the developers understood the radio's importance enough to implement it through the PlayStation 5 controller's speaker, making the static emit from your hands, creating additional immersive layer. This physical proximity to the warning sound increases its effectiveness. It's not just audio from your TV or headphones, it's coming from the object in your hands, making the danger feel that much more immediate and personal. The radio shouldn't work. A broken device emitting static shouldn't be useful for anything except annoyance. But in Silent Hill's logic, broken things function in impossible ways, providing information through mechanisms that defy explanation. And somehow, this broken radio warning of invisible threats becomes one of the most effective horror devices in gaming, transforming absence into presence, silence into threat, and uncertainty into sustained dread. The silence between screams. Akira Yamaoka joined Team Silent as sound designer and composer, and what he understood about horror audio would define the series as profoundly as any visual element. His philosophy, articulated across numerous interviews over the decades, was counterintuitive. Silence impresses people more than beautiful music. In Yamaoka's framework, the absence of sound is a weapon, and he wielded it with precision that changed how horror games approached audio design. Most games in 1999 filled every moment with sound. Resident Evil maintained constant ambient loops, the mansion's ominous drone, the police station's emergency sirens, laboratory machinery humming beneath everything. Every room had audio presence establishing mood. Silence appeared only briefly, punctuating specific moments before ambient sound returned. This made sense as conventional design philosophy. Empty audio suggests technical failure, creates discomfort that needs filling. The assumption was that horror required constant sonic reinforcement, that tension came from ominous music and unsettling ambient beds maintaining emotional state. Yamaoka rejected this entirely. Silent Hill embraces quiet. Long stretches of gameplay pass with only footsteps on pavement, distant water dripping, wind moving through empty streets. The game lets you exist in near silence, which makes you hyper aware of every sound that does occur. When glass shatters in Cafe 5 to 2, the impact is shocking, not because the sound itself is particularly violent, but because it punctures 5 minutes of quiet. When you've been walking fog-shrouded streets, hearing nothing but your own movement, any sudden sound is violence against established calm. This creates dynamic range that amplifies every audio event. In Resident Evil, zombie moans occur constantly, becoming background texture you learn to filter out. Doors creak and footsteps echo over persistent ambient beds. Everything competes for attention in a crowded soundscape. Silent Hill's approach creates contrast. Silence establishes baseline, making departures from that baseline exponentially more effective. The radio's static spike hits hard because it breaks quiet. Creature sounds are genuinely disturbing because they're not competing with music or ambient noise. Environmental audio, a door creaking in wind, chains rattling somewhere in fog, becomes ominous precisely because it's the only sound happening. The save point music demonstrates this perfectly. Throughout Silent Hill, save points are marked by a specific melancholic melody, gentle and sad, almost comforting in its consistency. This music becomes Pavlovian signal. You hear those notes and know you're safe, that enemies won't appear here, that you can breathe. The psychological conditioning is brilliant. In a game that withholds musical comfort, these small islands of melody become profoundly important. They're not triumphant save room themes. They're quiet acknowledgments that you've survived to this point, brief respites that never quite erase the underlying sadness. The melody itself is tinged with loss, reflecting the game's tone even in moments of relative safety. When music does appear during gameplay, it's often impossible to distinguish where sound design ends and composition begins. Yamaoka drew heavily from industrial music, artists like Nine Inch Nails, Coil, Throbbing Gristle who used found sounds, machine noise, distortion, and harsh textures rather than traditional instrumentation. Tracks layer what might be musical tones with what might be environmental sounds. Is that sustained note a synthesizer or machinery? Is that rhythmic element percussion or industrial equipment? The ambiguity is intentional. It creates soundscapes that feel mechanical, suffocating, broken. A track called My Heaven uses processed children's voices, creating something uncanny. Innocent sounds twisted into wrongness. Killed by Death features what sounds like medical equipment. Heartbeat monitors flatlines, industrial percussion suggesting both machinery and violence. These compositions appear sparingly, often layered so subtly you might not consciously register music is playing. They create unease without demanding attention, work beneath awareness rather than announcing themselves. This restraint makes them more effective. When you do become consciously aware of the music, when it rises to prominence during key moments, the impact is tremendous because it feels earned rather than manipulative. The otherworld sections intensify this approach. When the town shifts to nightmare state, audio transforms with it. Industrial clangs echo through spaces. Metal scrapes against metal without visible source. Distant sounds that might be screams or might be wind through broken infrastructure create constant, low-level wrongness. Yamaoka deliberately places sounds ahead of visual cues, letting you hear something wrong before seeing it. This triggers imagination, which is always more effective than scripted scares. The sound of something heavy dragging across metal grating becomes more frightening than seeing what's being dragged, because your mind supplies possibilities worse than any visual could deliver. Boss encounters break the silence more dramatically, but not with orchestral bombast. The split head fight in the school boiler room features percussive, grinding music that sounds like machinery consuming itself. It's hostile music, aggressive without being epic. You're not meant to feel empowered for battle. You're meant to feel like the environment wants you gone, like the space itself is rejecting your presence. The music doesn't encourage or energize, it pressures and oppresses, matching the tight arena and the horror of the creature. It's claustrophobic sound for claustrophobic space. This audio philosophy was revolutionary. Resident Evil's soundtrack, composed by Masami Ueda, Makoto Tomozawa, and Akari Kaida, was traditionally cinematic, orchestral strings for tension, brass for action, clear musical language signaling emotional states. Players understood the grammar because it borrowed from horror film scoring. Silent Hill's approach was anti-cinematic, using silence and industrial noise to create unease that traditional scoring couldn't achieve. It didn't tell you how to feel. It created sonic environments that made you feel without instruction. Silent Hill 2's soundtrack is often cited as one of gaming's greatest musical achievements. But what's remarkable is how much of that soundtrack is silence punctuated by specific compositions. Theme of Laura is achingly melodic, beautiful, and tragic, sounding like genuine emotional expression rather than video game music. Promise plays during emotional climax and functions as real song, something that could exist independently outside the game. But these moments of melody are precious because they're rare, because they emerge from hours of near silence and industrial noise like flowers growing in rust. Yamaoka introduced more melodic guitar work in the sequel, layering it with industrial foundations, creating sound identity that separated Silent Hill from every other horror property. The melancholy beauty of his melodic work exists in direct contrast to the harsh noise elements, creating tonal complexity that mirrors the games themselves, beautiful and horrific, tender and violent, sad and terrifying, existing simultaneously. This emotional sophistication in game audio was unprecedented. Most game soundtracks aimed for consistency of tone. Yamaoka embraced contradiction, let sadness and horror coexist, created space for beauty in nightmare. The influence ripples through horror gaming. Fatal Frame used silence and sudden audio stings. Condemned employed minimal music and emphasized environmental sound. Amnesia, The Dark Descent, used silence extensively, making musical cues that much more impactful when they occurred. But few achieved the balance Yamaoka found, where music was rare enough to be meaningful and silence was long enough to create genuine unease. Other horror games that tried to copy this often made the mistake of simply removing music without understanding what silence was supposed to accomplish, creating empty soundscapes that felt incomplete rather than deliberately minimal. What's lost in most discussions is how Yamaoka's approach changed player behavior in subtle ways. The absence of constant audio cues means you listen more carefully to environmental sounds. You learn to distinguish creature audio from wind, to recognize the difference between chains rattling naturally and chains moved by something. You become more alert to acoustic space. Does this area sound enclosed or open? Are there echoes suggesting large rooms, or does sound die quickly indicating tight spaces? Without music obscuring environmental audio, you develop better spatial awareness through sound, using acoustic information to navigate and assess threat in ways that music-heavy games don't require. The radio becomes more effective in this context too. When ambient audio is minimal, the static spike of the radio warning system cuts through with tremendous clarity. You're not filtering it out of busy soundscape. It announces itself against near silence, commanding immediate attention. And when the radio goes quiet after extended static, that silence itself becomes information. Threat has passed, danger moved away, you can breathe. The dynamic between radio static and silence becomes a language you learn to read, providing constantly updating information about your safety level. Yamaoka's departure from Konami after years as series composer was treated by fans as genuine loss, confirmation that subsequent Silent Hill games would lack something essential. And they were right. Later entries without his involvement felt different, lesser, not because replacement composers were untalented, but because they didn't understand the philosophy. They composed horror game music using conventional approaches, more sound, more obvious musical cues, less trust in silence. The soul of Silent Hill's audio design was specifically Yamaoka's understanding that less is more, that absence is presence, that silence is the canvas on which all other sounds gain meaning. In the end, the greatest compliment to Yamaoka's work is how many horror games learned from it. The modern horror game soundscape, sparse, atmospheric, trusting silence, owes tremendous debt to what he pioneered. But in 1999, when games were expected to have constant musical accompaniment, when silence was seen as emptiness rather than tool, Yamaoka's approach was radical. And it worked because he understood something fundamental. The human mind fears what it cannot fully perceive, and in silence we hear everything we're afraid of, the monsters you create. Every creature in Silent Hill is wrong in specific ways, not generically monstrous but pointedly disturbing, designed to trigger particular forms of discomfort. And here's what almost never gets proper analysis. These designs work because they exploit specific fears about bodies, about vulnerability, about sexuality and violence and disease. The monsters aren't random nightmare fuel. They're carefully crafted psychological triggers, and understanding their design reveals how sophisticated Team Silent's approach to horror actually was. Let's start with the gray children from the first game. Small, hunched figures with oversized knives, their proportions deliberately disturbing, too large heads, stunted bodies, movements that suggest both child and something inhuman. They appear primarily in the elementary school, which isn't coincidence. Harry is searching for his daughter. The gray children represent corrupted innocence, children transformed into threats, forcing Harry to strike at small figures, wielding weapons far too large for their frames. The psychological weight of fighting child-sized enemies is significant, triggering deep-seated protections against harming young. Team Silent knew this, exploited it, made players uncomfortable not through cheap shock, but through design that weaponized instinctual responses. The nurses, appearing across multiple games with variations, deserve extensive examination. These creatures wear nurse uniforms, move with jerky, sexualized motions, and represent deeply uncomfortable conflation of care and threat, sexuality and violence, vulnerability and danger. In Silent Hill 2, the Bubblehead nurses are James Sunderland's manifestations, and their design speaks directly to his psychology. They wear low-cut uniforms emphasizing sexuality. They move with hip-swaying gait and convulsive twitching. Their faces are obscured, featureless or bubbled over, denying them identity or humanity. These design choices reflect James's complicated feelings about caregivers during Mary's illness, about nurses who attended his dying wife, about the conflicting emotions of sexual frustration and grief, about seeing female bodies in medical context while his wife withered. The brilliance is how these design elements make the nurses deeply uncomfortable to fight. They're clearly threats. They attack with pipes. They're hostile and deadly. But they're humanoid, feminine, moving in ways coded as sexual, and destroying them feels transgressive in ways fighting obviously monstrous creatures doesn't. This discomfort is intentional. James should feel disturbed fighting them. Players should feel unsettled by the sexualized violence the game forces them to participate in. The nurses make you complicit in something that feels wrong, which is exactly what Silent Hill 2 is about. James's complicity in his own moral failures. Pyramid Head stands as perhaps gaming's most iconic monster, and for good reason. His design is masterful exercise in creating threatening presence through physicality and symbolism. The pyramid helmet serves multiple purposes. It obscures any human features, denying the possibility of reasoning or communication. Its geometry is harsh, angular, wrong, nothing organic or natural about it. It's too large to be functional, suggesting the creature carries tremendous burden. Straining under weight, it refuses to set down. The helmet also evokes images of executioner hoods, positioning Pyramid Head as Punisher, as judgment made manifest. His body is impossibly muscular, hypermasculine to disturbing degree, wearing butcher's apron stained with blood. He carries enormous weapons, the great knife too large to be wielded practically, the spear massive and brutal. Everything about his design suggests overwhelming physical power, unstoppable force, violent capability beyond measure, and his movements reinforce this. Slow, deliberate, unhurried. He doesn't chase frantically. He doesn't need to. He's inevitable. The sexual violence Pyramid Head enacts, particularly the infamous scene with the mannequins, is deeply uncomfortable and absolutely intentional. Team Silent knew this scene would disturb players. They included it specifically to communicate something about James's psychology, about his guilt around sexuality and death, about how those two elements have become horrifically intertwined in his mind. Pyramid Head represents James's desire for punishment. his belief that he deserves to suffer for what he's done. The creature's sexual violence reflects James's own twisted guilt about sexual frustration during Mary's illness, about desires he had while his wife was dying, about the corruption of intimacy by disease and resentment. What makes this design brilliant is its specificity. Pyramid Head doesn't work as generic monster. He works specifically for James Sunderland's story, as manifestation of that particular character's particular guilt. This is why attempts to use Pyramid Head in other Silent Hill properties feel wrong. He's not the series mascot. He's one man's punishment made flesh, and removing him from that context drains his meaning. The abstract daddy from the Otherworld Hotel takes body horror to extreme, and again the design is specific to character psychology. This creature appears as two bodies fused together on a bed frame, writhing in movements suggesting sexual violence. The victims see it differently based on their trauma. For Angela, it represents her father's abuse, the violation of trust and innocence, the inescapability of trauma literally fused to furniture where abuse occurred. The creature's design doesn't hide its meaning. It forces players to witness horror that isn't metaphorical but disturbingly literal. This is what trauma looks like given physical form. This is violation made visible. This is pain that cannot be separated from the person carrying it. The lying figures, James encounters these as some of the first creatures, deserve recognition for brilliant design economy. They appear as human forms completely encased in straitjacket-like flesh, no visible features, squirming and thrashing, vomiting acidic spray. These represent repression, truth constrained, reality suffocated beneath denial. They can't speak, can't communicate, can only flail and expel poison. For James, they reflect his own denial about Mary's death, about his role in it, about truths he's suffocating beneath lies he tells himself. The creatures literally cannot express themselves, trapped inside themselves, which mirrors James's psychological state perfectly. What's sophisticated about Silent Hill's monster design philosophy is the restraint. The creatures appear in reasonable numbers. You're not fighting endless waves. Encounters are spaced, allowing each creature appearance to feel significant rather than routine. This is crucial to maintaining their effectiveness as horror elements. In action games, enemies become obstacles through repetition. You learn patterns, develop strategies, and they lose individual impact. Silent Hill spaces encounters carefully ensures you never quite become comfortable with creatures, never quite feel you've mastered fighting them. The sound design accompanying monsters amplifies their wrongness. Gray children make childlike sounds twisted into something alien. Nurses moan and gasp in ways suggesting pain and something more disturbing. Pyramid Head's presence is announced by metallic scraping of his helmet and blade dragging across surfaces. These audio signatures warn of presence before visual confirmation, letting imagination work before reality, ensuring the reveal rarely diminishes the anticipation. Color palette and texture work contribute enormously. The creatures share aesthetic with otherworld environments, rust, blood, decay, disease. They're not separate from the nightmare space but extensions of it, suggesting they emerge from the town itself rather than invading it. This makes them feel inevitable rather than random, integrated into the logic of Silent Hill rather than imposed upon it. The influence of these designs appears throughout horror gaming. Dead Space's necromorphs use similar body horror, human forms twisted into weapons, recognizable enough to trigger revulsion at what was done to them. The Last of Us's clickers and bloaters present infected humans transforming into something fungal and inhuman, playing with similar fears about loss of humanity and bodily corruption. Resident Evil 7's molded use similar principles. vaguely humanoid forms made of corrupted organic matter, moving in unsettling ways. But few games have matched Silent Hill's sophistication in creating monsters specifically tailored to protagonist psychology, creatures that mean something beyond generic threat. Because you're still here, now we can get even deeper into how Silent Hill constructs its nightmares. That explains why the creatures exist as psychological manifestations, but it doesn't explain why these specific manifestations are so effective, why they linger in memory decades after playing, why Pyramid Head became cultural icon recognized far beyond gaming. The answer is uncomfortable. These designs work because they weaponize human vulnerability, because they make us confront things we'd prefer to ignore, because they don't let us maintain comfortable distance between gameplay violence and actual meaning. Silent Hill doesn't let you kill monsters thoughtlessly. It makes you feel every enemy encounter as participation in something disturbing, forces you to recognize what you're destroying and why. And that recognition that these aren't just obstacles but reflections of human damage is what makes Silent Hill's horror resonate long after the game ends. The camera that judges Silent Hill's fixed camera angles are often dismissed as dated limitation, holdover from Resident Evil's pre-rendered background era that Team Silent couldn't or wouldn't move beyond. But this analysis misses how deliberately Silent Hill uses camera positioning not just to show environments but to create specific psychological effects, to manipulate player perception in ways that serve horror. The camera in Silent Hill isn't neutral observer, it's active participant in creating dread, and its specific choices reveal sophistication that deserves recognition. Fixed cameras were indeed Resident Evil convention, position camera to show pre-rendered backgrounds from optimal angles, let player-controlled character move through these spaces while camera remained static or transitioned between preset positions. This created the famous tank controls, where character orientation determined movement direction rather than camera relative inputs. It was clunky, required adjustment, but served the pre-rendered background technology well. Silent Hill used real-time three-dimensional environments, not pre-rendered backgrounds. Technically, they could have used following camera, over-the-shoulder view, or any modern camera system. The choice to use fixed angles was deliberate artistic decision, not technical necessity, and examining specific camera placements reveals why. The camera frequently positions itself to obscure information. Angles place walls or corners between camera and player character, blocking view of immediate surroundings. Cameras position high, looking down, creating vulnerability. You're exposed to view from above while unable to see what might be approaching from ground level. Cameras position low, looking up, making environments loom oppressively. None of these angles are optimized for clear navigation. They're optimized for unease. Consider early sequences in Midwich Elementary School. The camera often places itself at corridor ends, looking down long hallways toward Harry. This creates several effects. Distance between camera and character emphasizes isolation and vulnerability. Harry appears small in frame, dwarfed by environment, and critically, you cannot see what's behind Harry, cannot confirm whether something is following. You must trust that nothing is approaching from off camera, and that trust is constantly tested by the radio crackling static, by creature sounds from indeterminate direction, by the knowledge that enemies exist in these spaces. The camera also frequently cuts at thresholds, doorways, corners, room transitions. These cuts are jarring, disorienting, requiring moment to re-establish spatial awareness in new camera angle. Horror films use similar techniques, disorienting viewers to prevent comfort, to maintain uncertainty about space. Silent Hill applies this cinematic technique to interactive medium, using camera cuts to create momentary vulnerability where you're not quite sure which direction you're facing, which direction enemies might attack from. What's brilliant is how camera angles create what film theorists call non-diegetic anxiety. Fear not of what's happening in the story, but of what the presentation might be hiding. When camera is positioned such that large portions of the environment are occluded, when character is small in frame with significant empty space surrounding them, when cuts happen frequently enough to prevent comfortable mental mapping of space, players experience anxiety not from threats they can see, but from the possibility of threats they cannot. The camera also makes interesting choices about what it emphasizes. Sometimes it frames environmental details, that open locker, that blood stain, that writing on walls, drawing attention to narrative elements. Other times it deliberately obscures details, positioning angles such that seeing items or clues requires awkward character, positioning, and movement. This isn't bad design, it's intentional friction, making information gathering require effort and uncertainty. Boss encounters use camera particularly effectively. The split-head battle in the school boiler room uses camera angle that shows the creature's full body while keeping Harry relatively small in frame, emphasizing size disparity and threat. The positioning also means you're frequently viewing Harry from angles where his attacks are difficult to judge, where distance between him and enemy is uncertain. This makes a mechanically simple fight feel more chaotic and dangerous than it would with optimal camera positioning. Outdoor sequences in fog use camera differently but equally effectively. Here, camera often pulls back further, showing more environment but less detail. Harry becomes smaller figure moving through vast gray nothing, emphasizing isolation and lost quality. The camera height varies, sometimes eye level suggesting observer watching Harry, sometimes overhead creating godlike surveillance view that suggests he's being watched, studied, judged. The psychological impact of feeling watched cannot be overstated. When camera positions suggest observer perspective, particularly angles that Harry could not himself see from, positions that imply someone else's vantage point, players experience subtle anxiety from surveillance. Horror films use this extensively, the killer's perspective, the watching from hiding angle. Silent Hill employs it interactively, making players feel their character is being observed by malevolent presence they cannot see or confront. The camera also participates in creating the dreamlike, disoriented quality central to Silent Hill's atmosphere. The frequent angle changes, the non-optimal positioning, the way space is fragmented across multiple camera perspectives rather than presented coherently. All of this contributes to feeling that space itself is unreliable, that environmental consistency cannot be trusted. This mirrors dream logic, where spaces connect, impossibly, where perspective shifts without warning, where nothing quite holds together upon examination. Silent Hill 2 made particularly sophisticated camera choices. The opening town sequences use camera position to emphasize desolation and vast emptiness. Wide angles showing James walking through abandoned streets, small figure in gray vastness. Brookhaven Hospital uses tighter angles, more claustrophobic framing, reflecting increasing psychological pressure. The prison sequences use harsh angles and extreme positioning, cameras in corners creating distorted perspective, cameras positioned to show James from above as though he's already judged and sentenced. The influence of these camera techniques appears most clearly in later survival horror games that specifically invoked Silent Hill's style. Siren used similar fixed angles and disorienting cuts. Rule of Rose employed camera positioning to create vulnerability and unease. Even games that moved to modern camera systems sometimes incorporated fixed angle sequences for specific effect. The evil within used forced perspectives for key sequences, recognizing how camera positioning could manipulate player emotion independently of content. What gets lost when dismissing Silent Hill's camera as outdated is understanding that it's performing narrative and emotional work. Yes, modern cameras offer more flexibility and control, but they also offer more confidence, more certainty, more player power over perspective. Silent Hill's camera denies you control over viewpoint, forces you to see from perspectives you didn't choose, creates vulnerability through restricted vision. This loss of control is horrifying in ways that empowering cameras cannot replicate. The camera in Silent Hill judges you. It watches from angles that suggest surveillance. It positions itself to maximize your vulnerability. It denies you comfort or optimal viewing. It participates in disorientation and uncertainty. It's not neutral tool showing you game space. It's active element creating psychological effect, using every trick of horror cinema translated to interactive medium. And dismissing it as dated means missing how deliberately, how effectively, how sophisticatedly it's doing its job. The puzzles that shouldn't matter. Silent Hill's puzzles are frequently cited as one of the series' weaker elements, too obscure, too random, breaking immersion with incongruous riddles that seem disconnected from narrative. But this criticism fundamentally misunderstands what the puzzles are doing and why they work in context. The puzzles in Silent Hill aren't meant to be realistic. They're psychological exercises, manifestations of how protagonists process information under extreme duress, and examining them reveals another layer of sophistication in how the series constructs horror. Let's address the elephant first. Yes, it's absurd that elementary schools and hospitals have elaborate puzzle locks. No reasonable architect would design keypad requiring knowledge of poetry to unlock supply closet. No sane person would create piano puzzle protecting access to necessary item. Taken as literal reality, Silent Hill's puzzles are ridiculous. But they're not literal reality. They're psychological reality, manifestations of how traumatized minds organize and restrict information. Consider the puzzle structure. You find cryptic clues, poems, riddles, obtuse hints. You explore environments collecting pieces, keys, items, notes. You synthesize information across disparate sources. You solve the puzzle and progress. What does this mirror? Trauma processing. When dealing with traumatic experience, memories don't arrive linearly or clearly. They appear as fragments, sensory impressions, emotional flashes, scattered pieces that don't immediately cohere. Processing trauma requires gathering these fragments, finding patterns, synthesizing narrative from chaos. The puzzles literalize this process. You're gathering psychological fragments, assembling coherent understanding from scattered clues, finding keys that unlock progression. The obtuse nature of the puzzles serves specific purpose. If they were straightforward, find key card, open door, they wouldn't create the mental state Silent Hill requires. The difficulty, the need to pay close attention to environment and text, the requirement that you engage deeply with clues, all of this creates sustained focus and mounting frustration that contributes to psychological pressure. You're not moving smoothly through spaces. You're stuck, forced to carefully examine your surroundings, reading and rereading obtuse clues, trying different combinations. This mirrors the protagonist's experience, trying desperately to make sense of senseless situation, searching for logic in illogical circumstances, becoming increasingly frustrated and desperate for answers that won't quite cohere. The poetic, Literary nature of many clues adds layer of meaning. Silent Hill frequently references fairy tales, poems, religious texts, mythology. The first game uses Mother Goose rhymes. The third includes obscure Shakespeare references. These aren't random. They're drawing from cultural reservoir of stories about innocence corrupted, about guilt and punishment, about quests and judgment. By requiring players engage with these texts, the game situates itself within tradition of moral literature, of stories that teach and warn and judge. You're not just solving mechanical puzzles, you're decoding allegorical references that comment on the protagonist's journey. The difficulty settings alter puzzle complexity, which is elegant solution to accessibility while maintaining design intention. On easy, puzzles are straightforward. On hard, they become genuinely challenging, requiring careful thought and observation. This lets players choose their level of engagement while preserving the core function, making you stop, think, examine environment, and synthesize information. The hardest puzzles in the series require genuine insight, pattern recognition across multiple clues, and careful environmental observation that rewards attention to detail. What's sophisticated is how puzzles integrate with environmental storytelling. Solving them requires reading documents, examining objects, noticing details in environment design. This forced attention means players engage deeply with spaces, notice things they might otherwise miss, build richer understanding of world and narrative. The puzzle in Brookhaven Hospital requiring knowledge of patient histories means you read those files, learn about these people, understand the suffering that occurred here. The puzzle becomes vehicle for narrative delivery, ensuring you don't just pass through space but truly inhabit it. The puzzles also create pacing variation. Silent Hill isn't constant action or constant exploration. It alternates between navigation through fog, combat encounters, puzzle solving, and narrative sequences. This variation prevents monotony while allowing different types of gameplay to serve horror in different ways. Combat creates immediate physical threat. Fog navigation creates environmental dread. Puzzles create intellectual frustration and mounting pressure. Together, they maintain engagement through variety while serving unified emotional purpose. Some puzzles are genuinely brilliant in construction. The Shakespeare puzzle in Silent Hill 3 requires understanding of 5 different plays, reference through oblique hints, synthesizing that knowledge into order code. It's challenging but fair. All information needed is present, and solving it requires actual literary knowledge or willingness to research. This respects player intelligence, assumes capability for complex thought, treats audience as capable of difficult intellectual engagement. How many horror games trust players with puzzles of genuine complexity? The criticism that puzzles break immersion assumes immersion requires realistic verisimilitude, that everything must function as it would in reality. But Silent Hill never pretended to be realistic. From the opening moments, it establishes dream logic, psychological rather than physical reality. Within that framework, puzzles make perfect sense. They're manifestations of mental barriers, psychological locks that prevent protagonists from progressing until they've processed necessary information. Literal representations of cognitive challenges trauma creates. Other horror games largely abandon complex environmental puzzles, moving towards simpler mechanics, or removing puzzles entirely. Resident Evil shifted toward more action-focused gameplay with simpler puzzle elements. Modern horror often favors accessibility over complexity, but something is lost in that shift. The requirement that players slow down, engage thoughtfully with environments, struggle with challenges that aren't combat-based. Silent Hill's puzzles demand different kind of engagement, intellectual rather than reflexive, and that variety serves the overall experience even when individual puzzles frustrate. The puzzles that shouldn't matter actually matter tremendously. They force contemplation in game designed to create psychological horror. They require environmental engagement that enriches world building. They create frustration and pressure that contribute to desired emotional state. They trust player intelligence with genuinely complex challenges. And they reinforce the psychological rather than physical reality the series operates within. Yes, they're unrealistic, but in game about psychological manifestation, about trauma made environmental, about nightmare logic superseding physical law, unrealistic puzzles are exactly right. The map that trusts you. In an era when games held players' hands with objective markers, glowing trails, and constant UI reminders, Silent Hill handed you a paper map and said figure it out. This seems like small detail, but the navigation system in Silent Hill represents fundamental trust in player intelligence that was radical then and remains rare now. The map doesn't update automatically. It doesn't show your current position. It doesn't mark objectives with convenient icons. It's a static piece of paper, literally a piece of paper within the game world that Harry pulls out and examines. And learning to read it, to orient yourself within fog-shrouded streets, to mark your own progress and plan your own routes, creates player agency and spatial mastery that GPS-style navigation can never replicate. When you find a map in Silent Hill, you're finding an in-world object. Harry picks it up, can examine it in inventory, and when you access it during gameplay, you're seeing what Harry sees, a tourist map of Silent Hill with street names, building labels, and basic geography. That's all. No "you are here" indicator. No waypoints. No highlighted path to next objective. Just map. The game trusts that you can look at this map, look at your surroundings, identify where you are based on environmental landmarks, and navigate accordingly. This creates several important effects. First, it requires genuine spatial awareness. You must pay attention to street signs, to building appearances, to landmarks that help you orient. That police station with the distinctive facade, where is that on the map? You passed a pharmacy 3 blocks back. Does that help you identify current location? The alley you're walking through, is this the one that cuts between Bachman and Katz, or are you further north? This constant mental work of matching environment to map representation keeps you engaged with navigation in ways that automatic positioning never could. Second, it creates opportunities for getting lost. And getting lost in Silent Hill is terrifying. The fog means you can't see distant landmarks. Streets look similar. Panic and disorientation are real possibilities, especially for new players. You thought you were heading toward the hospital, but somehow ended up back near the school. You're certain this street should connect to the one you need, but it dead ends. That rising panic when you're not sure where you are, when the radio's crackling and you can't find the save point you thought was nearby, when you're low on health and turned around. That's horror the game creates through navigation systems rather than monster encounters. Third, it makes navigation feel like accomplishment. When you successfully navigate fog-shrouded streets to reach your destination, when you correctly identify your location and plot efficient route, when you discover shortcuts and learn the layout well enough to move confidently, these feel like real achievements because the game didn't do the work for you. You learned this space. You mastered this geography. The satisfaction is genuine because the challenge was genuine. The map also integrates beautifully with the memo system. As you find important information, the hospital is north of the lake. The key is in the second floor office. You can add notes to your map, marking locations and writing reminders. This transforms the map from static reference to personalized navigation tool, reflecting your unique playthrough and information gathering process. It's your map now, marked with your observations, serving your specific needs. What's particularly elegant is how the map system respects different player approaches. Some players meticulously mark everything, creating detailed, annotated maps. Others rely primarily on memory, consulting the map only when genuinely lost. Some players learn the town geography so thoroughly they barely need the map at all. The system accommodates all these styles without requiring specific approach, trusting players to engage with it however works best for them. The map also serves narrative function. It's a tourist map of Silent Hill, showing the town as it existed before becoming Nightmare Realm. This creates poignant contrast, the cheerful, helpful tourist guide for a place that no longer exists, at least not in any form tourists would recognize. The map represents what Silent Hill was supposed to be, and consulting it while navigating Nightmare Version creates constant reminder of the gap between intended purpose and current reality. Compare this to modern navigation systems. Most contemporary games include mini-maps showing your position, direction face, nearby points of interest, objective markers. Some games include compass bar with distance indicators to next goal. Many feature glowing trails or highlighted paths showing exactly where to go. These systems prioritize convenience and accessibility, ensuring players never feel lost or confused about where to go next. They're efficient, they're helpful. They also completely remove navigation as meaningful gameplay element. Resident Evil used similar map system to Silent Hill. In world maps you collected static representations of environments, but Resident Evil's spaces were primarily interior and relatively compact. The mansion, the police station, the laboratory, these were large but bounded spaces where getting lost was temporary inconvenience rather than genuine threat. Silent Hill's exterior town environments are larger, more open, easier to become disoriented within, making the map more essential and navigation more challenging. The map system also contributes to the series' replayability in subtle ways. On first playthrough, you're constantly consulting the map, carefully navigating, frequently getting turned around. On subsequent playthroughs, you know the geography, can move efficiently between locations, feel mastery over space that was initially overwhelming. This progression from confused newcomer to confident navigator mirrors protagonist journeys in some ways, starting lost and afraid, eventually understanding the space well enough to move through it purposefully. Silent Hill 2 expanded the map system beautifully. James collects multiple maps for different areas: the town, the apartments, the hospital, the prison. Each map is appropriate to its space. Apartment building floor plans, hospital wings clearly labeled, prison cell blocks marked. The game continues trusting players to navigate without hand-holding while providing tools necessary for success. And again, annotation system lets you mark locations, write notes, create personalized navigation aids. Later games in the series maintain this approach even as industry trends move toward more assistive navigation. Silent Hill 3, 4, Origins, Homecoming all retained paper map systems, all continued trusting players with navigation challenge, all resisted adding modern GPS-style assistance. This consistency suggests Team Silent and subsequent developers recognize the map system as essential to the experience, not just convenient holdover from earlier design era. The influence appears in interesting places. The Dark Souls series famously provides minimal navigation assistance, expecting players to learn world geography through exploration and observation. While those games don't use traditional maps, the design philosophy trusts players to learn spaces, to navigate based on mastery rather than assistance, to feel accomplishment through orientation, descends partly from what Silent Hill established. Games like Obra Dinn and Return of the Obra Dinn require players to carefully track information and spatial relationships without automatic systems handling it for them. Survival games like The Long Dark use minimal UI and require genuine navigation skill, but most modern horror games abandon this approach. Resident Evil 7 and 8 include objective markers and guided navigation. Dead Space had waypoint systems showing path to objectives. The Last of Us uses listening mode, highlighting enemies and objectives through walls. These games chose accessibility and convenience over navigation challenge, which is valid design choice serving different goals. But something is lost: the satisfaction of genuine spatial mastery, the fear of being genuinely lost, the respect for player intelligence that says, you can figure this out. The map in Silent Hill is a piece of paper. It doesn't update magically. It doesn't show your position automatically. It doesn't guide you to objectives. It just shows you the town and trusts that you're smart enough to navigate it. In an industry increasingly focused on ensuring players never feel confused or lost, on smoothing every rough edge and assisting every challenge, Silent Hill's map stands as a reminder that respecting player intelligence, that trusting players with genuine challenges, that allowing moments of confusion and disorientation, these aren't flaws. They're features. They're opportunities for players to feel smart when they succeed, to develop genuine mastery, to engage with game world in meaningful ways that go beyond following waypoint to next cutscene. The endings that hurt. Most horror games give you the ending. Maybe two endings if you're lucky, good and bad, determined by simple binary choice or completion metric. Silent Hill presents multiple endings for each game, and these aren't simple good versus bad alternatives. They're complex narrative conclusions reflecting player behavior throughout the entire game in ways that are sometimes obvious and sometimes so subtle you might not realize your actions were being judged. And critically, several of these endings are genuinely painful, offering conclusions that hurt precisely because they're earned, because they reflect failures or truths that player behavior revealed. This system of consequences and meaning in endings was sophisticated in 1999 and remains impressive today. The first Silent Hill offers 5 endings, and obtaining them depends on actions throughout the game that you might not realize matter. Did you save Kaufman from the hotel fire? Did you find and use the mysterious red liquid Aglaophotis? How much health did Sybil have when you encountered her? These choices and conditions determine which ending you receive, and the game never explicitly tells you it's tracking these factors. You make decisions based on what seems right in the moment, and those decisions accumulate meaning you won't understand until the ending reveals which path you've been walking. The good ending shows Harry leaving Silent Hill with baby Cheryl, reborn from Alessa and Heather's fusion, walking away from the nightmare with his daughter returned to him. It's hopeful, but bittersweet. Cheryl isn't quite the same child he lost, and what he's been through can't be erased. The good plus ending is similar, but includes Sybil's survival, adding layer of hope that others made it through nightmare as well. The bad ending is darker. Harry leaves alone, Cheryl lost to him permanently, walking into fog with no clear destination or purpose. It's quiet devastation, acknowledgement that sometimes you fail despite best efforts, that not every story ends with restoration. The bad plus ending shows Kaufman escaping with Harry, which feels wrong. This man contributed to the nightmare, used people as tools, caused immense suffering, and he survives while innocents died. Then there's the UFO ending, absurdist comedy sequence where aliens abduct Harry. This could seem like throwaway joke, breaking game's serious tone, but it serves important function, pressure release. After completing extremely heavy, traumatic story, the joke ending offers catharsis through absurdity. It also rewards thorough players. Obtaining it requires collecting specific items across the game, demonstrating mastery and willingness to explore. The joke ending says, "You've taken this seriously. You've engaged deeply. Now here's permission to laugh." Silent Hill 2's ending system is more sophisticated, tracking numerous factors: how often you examine Mary's photo and letter, how much damage you take, how long you maintain low health, how many healing items you use, which locations you linger in. These factors aren't binary choices but accumulated behaviors, patterns the game observes throughout playthrough. You don't choose your ending through single decision. You've been choosing it through every action, through how you played, through what you paid attention to, through how you treated James's health and emotional state. The leave ending shows James walking away with Laura, choosing life and forward movement despite guilt. It suggests acceptance and possibility of redemption, of learning to live with what he's done while still living. It's hopeful, but not easy. James doesn't get absolution, just opportunity to try being better. The in-water ending has James drive his car into Toluca Lake, choosing suicide. This ending feels earned if you played James as someone damaged beyond repair, someone who examined Mary's photo obsessively, who let himself take damage as punishment, who lingered in painful locations. The game noticed your behavior and concluded that this James cannot live with himself. It's devastating precisely because it doesn't feel arbitrary. This ending matches how you played him. The Maria ending sees James leave with Maria, choosing the fantasy version of Mary over the real woman's memory. It's disturbing rather than hopeful. James hasn't processed his guilt or accepted truth, just replaced one person with another, learning nothing. This ending emerges from spending more time with Maria, from protecting her more carefully than Sybil, from choosing the comfortable lie over painful truth. The rebirth ending, obtained by collecting specific ritual items, shows James attempting to resurrect Mary through occult means, unable to accept her death. It's obsession rather than acceptance, desperate attempt to undo what cannot be undone. It's tragic precisely because James's love for Mary drives him to violate natural law rather than grieve properly. And again, the UFO ending provides absurdist relief, featuring James being abducted, while previous game's protagonist Harry appears piloting the ship. Its reward for taking the game seriously enough to seek out hidden items and codes across multiple playthroughs. What makes these ending systems brilliant is how they transform player behavior into narrative meaning. You're not just moving Avatar through spaces and making dialogue choices. Everything you do, what you examine, how you play, where you go, how you treat health and items, all of it becomes data the game uses to understand what kind of person this protagonist is in your hands, what kind of story you're telling through play. This is sophisticated integration of ludic and narrative elements, where gameplay isn't separate from story but directly creates story. The endings also create tremendous replay value. Once you know endings exist and behaviors influence what you receive, subsequent playthroughs become different. You can deliberately play James as suicidal, never healing, taking damage, examining photo constantly, to earn in-water ending. You can carefully cultivate specific ending by understanding what factors contribute to it, or you can play naturally and see which ending your instinctive behaviors lead toward, letting gameplay reveal something about how you approach the game's themes. The multiple endings also respect player interpretation. Silent Hill 2 especially doesn't have single canon ending. Different players connect with different conclusions based on how they read James's journey and what resolution feels appropriate. The game doesn't declare one ending right and others wrong. It offers possibilities, lets your playthrough determine which you experience, and allows community discussion about which endings feel most thematically appropriate. Later games continued this tradition. Silent Hill 3 tracks Heather's behavior to determine endings. Silent Hill 4, the room has multiple endings based on Eileen's condition and room exploration. The series committed to meaningful, multiple conclusions rather than single linear narrative, respecting player agency and recognizing that complex moral situations don't have single correct outcomes. The influence appears in games that took multiple endings seriously as narrative tools. Nier Automata requires multiple playthroughs to understand full narrative, with different endings revealing different facets of truth. The Stanley Parable made multiple endings core to its meta-narrative exploration. Undertale tracks player behavior to determine which ending you deserve. These games understood what Silent Hill established, that endings can be earned rather than chosen, that player behavior can be meaningful data, that multiple conclusions can each carry legitimate narrative weight. But here's what makes Silent Hill's endings particularly powerful. Several of them hurt, not in "you failed, game over" way, but in "this is the natural conclusion of the path you walked" way. The in-water ending is heartbreaking, but if you played James as someone beyond saving, it feels right. The bad ending of the first game is sad, but if you didn't save Sybil, if you didn't find a Gleophotis, if you didn't make choices that mattered, then Harry failing feels appropriate. The games don't protect you from painful conclusions. They let you earn them through play, and experiencing ending that reflects your failures or flaws is powerful in ways that generic game over screens never achieve. These are endings that respect tragedy, that recognize not every story concludes with triumph, that understand horror can be most effective when it denies comfortable resolution, and they're endings that respect you as player capable of handling complex emotional conclusions, worthy of narrative sophistication beyond simple good versus evil binaries. The endings that hurt are the ones you remember, the ones you think about, the ones that transform the entire game retroactively as you reconsider every choice that led here. And Silent Hill delivers those painful, meaningful endings better than almost any other game series. The town that remembers everything. Every horror game needs its haunted location, the mansion, the village, the space station, the asylum. But Silent Hill, the town, is different from every other horror setting in crucial ways that rarely get proper examination. It's not just a dangerous place or a source of monsters. It's a responsive entity, something that observes guilt and trauma and transforms itself accordingly, creating personalized nightmares tailored to whoever enters. And this isn't just lore background, it's core mechanical and narrative principle that affects everything from enemy design to environment transformation to which ending you receive. Understanding Silent Hill as active participant rather than passive setting reveals another layer of the series' sophistication. Most horror locations in games are effectively static. Raccoon City is overrun by bioorganic weapons, but it's the same infection for everyone. The USG Ishimura's necromorph infestation doesn't change based on Isaac Clarke's psychology. The village in Resident Evil 4 presents same threats regardless of who Leon is internally. These settings are dangerous to everyone equally, indifferent to the personal demons people bring with them. They're stages where horror occurs rather than active creators of horror. Silent Hill is different. The town reads people. It processes their guilt, their trauma, their fears, their secrets, and it manifests those internal states as external reality. This is why Harry's Silent Hill is different from James's Silent Hill, why Heather experiences different nightmare than Angela does when they're literally in the same building. The town isn't showing everyone the same horror. It's creating individualized experiences based on what will be most effective for each person. This has profound implications for how we understand what players experience. When you fight Pyramid Head as James Sunderland, you're not fighting a monster that exists independently. You're fighting James' guilt and desire for punishment given physical form by the town's power. When you encounter nurses, you're fighting manifestations of James's complicated feelings about caregivers and sexuality and disease. The town took those feelings, understood them, and created creatures designed to disturb James specifically. In Silent Hill 3, Heather encounters different creatures, manifestations of rage, violation, femininity under threat, because those are her issues, her traumas, and the town knows this. This personalization extends to environments. Brookhaven Hospital transforms into nightmare of flesh and rust, not because hospitals are generically scary, but because that specific hospital holds meaning for James, because his trauma is tied to medical spaces and illness, and Mary's deterioration. The apartment buildings James explores are manifestations of domestic space corrupted, reflecting his guilt about failing in role as husband. The prison sequences literalize judgment and punishment. Every location James visits is themed around his specific guilt and trauma. The town isn't just scary, it's scary in ways specifically designed to hurt James Sunderland. This creates fascinating narrative layer where nothing in Silent Hill can be taken at face value. The town isn't showing you objective reality. It's showing you subjective reality filtered through protagonist psychology and amplified by supernatural force. This means everything you see is interpretable, is potential metaphor, is possible symbol. When you see blood on walls, is it real blood or visual metaphor for violence and guilt? When you fight monsters, are you fighting actual creatures or physical manifestations of psychological struggles? The game never fully answers these questions, maintaining ambiguity that makes every element rich with possible meaning. The cult, the order, complicates this reading but doesn't contradict it. The cult's rituals and beliefs are real within game world, independent of protagonist psychology. Alessa's suffering, Dahlia's scheming, the attempts to birth their god, these have objective existence. But the town's power, awakened or amplified by cult actions, still operates through personalization. The cult may have created conditions for Silent Hill's supernatural manifestation, but how that power expresses varies based on who experiences it. The cult and the psychological reading coexist without negating each other. What's brilliant is how this framework explains the otherworld transitions. The fog world is already strange, abandoned town, no people, monsters, and streets, but it's recognizably a town navigable, grounded in physical reality, however corrupted. The other world is pure, psychological manifestation, rust and blood and chain link and impossible geometry, reflecting internal states without pretense of physical realism. The siren that announces transition is warning that reality is about to become fully subjective, that you're leaving space with any pretense of normalcy and entering pure nightmare. The town, remembering everything, also explains certain environmental details that would otherwise be inexplicable. Locations hold memories of events that occurred there. The Little Baroness wreck site in Toluca Lake holds Hannah's drowning decades later. The apartment building holds memories of murders and violence that preceded James's arrival. The town preserves trauma the way geological strata preserve ancient remains, layer upon layer of suffering compressed into space that can be accessed under right conditions. This makes Silent Hill unique among horror game locations. Most haunted spaces in games are haunted by their own histories. The mansion is scary because bioweapons research happened there. The hospital is frightening because of patient suffering. Silent Hill is scary because of your history, because of guilt and trauma you bring with you. The town weaponizes your internal life against you. This is why Silent Hill works narratively for protagonists with different backgrounds and traumas. The town adapts, reads whoever arrives, and creates appropriate nightmare. The implications for player experience are significant. You're not just navigating dangerous location, you're being actively profiled and targeted by intelligent force that understands what frightens you specifically. This creates paranoia beyond simple, dangerous place anxiety. The town is paying attention. It's learning you, understanding you, crafting horrors tailored to maximum effect. You cannot simply learn to handle the threats the way you might in other horror games, because the threats aren't static. They're dynamic responses to your character's psychology. This also means repeated playthroughs take on different meaning. You're not just running through the same content again. You're experiencing how the town responds to different protagonist states, to different player behaviors. On first playthrough, maybe you played James as desperate for redemption, examined Mary's photo often, tried to understand what happened. On second playthrough, you play him as suicidal, taking damage, lingering in painful spaces, and the town's response, the ending you receive, reflects that difference. The town is reactive not just to character, but to how you play character. The influence of this concept appears in psychological horror games that followed. Layers of Fear creates environments that shift and transform based on characters' artistic obsession and family trauma. Hellblade, Senua's Sacrifice manifests protagonist psychosis through environmental distortion and audio hallucinations. Control features spaces that respond to protagonist Jesse's mental state and repressed memories. These games learn from Silent Hill that horror locations can be active participants reflecting character psychology rather than static stages, but few match Silent Hill's sophistication in creating truly personalized horror. Most games create one nightmare and everyone experiences it identically. Silent Hill created framework where nightmare is bespoke, where the horror you experience is horror specifically designed for you, where the town has looked into you and created hell tailored to your particular damages. And that's terrifying in ways that generic horror, however well executed, can never quite achieve. The town isn't just dangerous, it knows you, it understands you better than you understand yourself, and it will use that knowledge to destroy you or force you to confront truths you'd rather die than face. The town remembers everything, every crime committed within its boundaries, every trauma experienced on its streets, every guilt carried through its fog, and when you arrive, it remembers you too, reads you like open book, and begins writing your nightmare in rust and blood and chains. That's the horror nobody talks about. Silent Hill isn't just a haunted town. It's a town that haunts you specifically, personally, deliberately, and that makes all the difference. The performances nobody heard. Silent Hill's voice acting is frequently mocked. Wooden delivery, awkward pauses, stilted dialogue. Critics and players have spent decades pointing out how bad the performances sound, but this criticism misses something crucial. The performances are supposed to sound wrong. These aren't actors failing to deliver lines naturally. These are deliberate choices creating atmosphere of disconnection and wrongness that serves the game's dreamlike, dissociative tone. The voice acting in Silent Hill is doing something sophisticated that gets dismissed as incompetence, and examining these performances reveals yet another layer of intentional design serving horror. Let's start with the most infamous example, the original Silent Hill's voice work. Harry Mason sounds uncertain, his delivery hesitant with strange pauses mid-sentence. Dahlia Gillespie speaks with affected theatricality that feels performative and false. Sybil Bennett's lines are delivered with odd emphasis, stressing unexpected words. To ears trained on naturalistic voice acting, this sounds like amateur hour. But listen to these performances in context of the nightmare Harry inhabits. Nothing in Silent Hill behaves naturally or feels right. The fog doesn't move correctly. The creatures defy biological logic. The architecture shifts impossibly. Why would human speech be the one element that functions normally? The stilted delivery creates uncanny valley effect with dialogue. The characters look vaguely human, move in roughly human ways, but speak just wrong enough to trigger discomfort. They sound like people trying to remember how humans talk, like something approximating human communication without fully understanding it. This matches the dreamlike quality of the entire experience. In nightmares, people speak strangely. Conversations don't flow naturally. Words carry wrong weight. Emphasis falls in wrong places. Meaning slips away even as you grasp for it. Silent Hill's voice acting replicates this nightmare communication, where everything sounds almost right but never quite achieves natural human interaction. The pauses deserve special attention. Characters stop mid-sentence, leaving dead air that would be edited out of professional productions. Harry says, "Have you seen a little girl? Short black hair?" The pauses feel wrong, uncomfortable, but they also feel like how trauma affects speech. People in shock speak haltingly. People disassociating from reality struggle to form coherent sentences. People trying to communicate impossible experiences, like towns full of monsters and shifting between reality and nightmare, would reasonably struggle to find words, to maintain conversational flow, to speak with confidence and naturalness. The pauses aren't actor mistakes, they're character reality. Silent Hill 2's voice acting continues this approach, but with more refinement. James Sunderland, voiced by Guy Seehey, delivers lines with depressive flatness, emotional exhaustion audible in every word. He sounds like someone going through motions of communication without investing emotion in it, which is exactly who James is. Someone so disconnected from his own feelings, so buried in denial and guilt, that he can barely access emotion anymore. When James says, "Mary, could you really be in this town?" he sounds less like someone asking genuine question and more like someone reciting lines he's supposed to say, which reflects his psychological state perfectly. He's performing the role of concerned husband looking for his wife while subconsciously knowing the truth he's hidden from himself. Maria's voice acting, also by Monica Taylor Horgan, provides fascinating contrast. She sounds more alive, more emotionally present, speaking with sultry inflection and deliberate seductiveness. The difference between how Maria sounds and how James sounds reflects their psychological roles. She's idealized fantasy, constructed seduction, everything he wished Mary could be. She sounds more vibrant because she isn't real person carrying real trauma. She's desire given voice, and desire speaks with confidence that traumatized people lack. Angela's performance by Donna Burke is heartbreaking when you understand what it's communicating. She speaks with disconnection and dissociation, her vocal affect flattened by trauma. Her lines about her past are delivered without emotional inflection, not because the actor can't emote, but because Angela has emotionally flatlined, has disconnected from feelings too painful to experience directly. When she says, "Mama, please," it's not dramatic or theatrical, it's quiet devastation, the sound of someone who's been broken so thoroughly that even expressing pain has become impossible. Criticism of bad voice acting often comes from comparing Silent Hill to Hollywood standards, to naturalistic film and television performances. But Silent Hill isn't aiming for that standard. It's creating specifically unnatural atmosphere where nothing functions correctly, where everything is slightly wrong, where reality itself is compromised. The voice acting serves this goal perfectly by being just off enough to maintain constant, low-level discomfort without being so egregious it becomes laughable, though it walks that line deliberately in places. The casting choices also matter. Team Silent used non-professional or semi-professional actors for many roles, people who brought authenticity without trained polish. This was budget consideration partially, but it also ensured performances wouldn't have professional smoothness that would have felt wrong, the slight amateurishness, the moments where actors seem uncertain or awkward, the lack of theatrical training showing through. All of it contributes to feeling that these are real people stumbling through impossible situation rather than characters in scripted drama. Compare this to later Resident Evil games that employed professional actors and motion capture for naturalistic performances. Those games aimed for cinematic quality, for performances indistinguishable from film. This serves their action horror tone well. Characters move and speak with confidence because they're capable people in extreme situations, and the performances reflect that capability. Silent Hill's characters aren't capable. They're ordinary people psychologically destroyed by circumstances they can't understand, and the performances reflect their incapability, their confusion, their disconnection from reality and self. The English voice acting specifically gets criticized more than Japanese performances, which is interesting because most Western players experience the game in English. The Japanese voice acting is more traditionally competent, more emotionally present, more theatrically expressive. But the English performances, with their flatness and strange delivery, arguably serve the game better for English-speaking audiences. The wrongness is more perceptible, more unsettling when it's in your native language. You notice the pauses, the odd emphasis, the disconnected quality more acutely than you would in language you don't fluently speak. Silent Hill 3 employed more professional voice talent, including Heather Morris as Heather Mason, and the performances are more traditionally competent, but they maintain certain wrongness. Heather's sarcastic delivery and emotional guardedness, Claudia's religious zealotry tinged with madness, Vincent's oily manipulation. The performances are less obviously bad, but still maintain atmosphere of people not quite communicating naturally, of conversation happening in nightmare, space where normal rules don't fully apply. The influence of this approach appears in interesting places. Deadly Premonition features deliberately awkward voice acting and strange dialogue that creates similar uncanny atmosphere. The Twin Peaks television series, which heavily influenced Silent Hill, featured David Lynch's direction pushing actors toward unnatural delivery that created dreamlike wrongness. Games like Pathologic use stilted translation and odd performances to create atmosphere of cultural displacement and wrongness. These works understand what Silent Hill demonstrated, that bad performances can serve artistic purpose if that purpose is creating specific emotional response rather than technical polish. What's lost when dismissing Silent Hill's voice acting as simply bad is understanding that it's contributing to total atmospheric effect. Every element works together. The fog limits visibility. The camera creates vulnerability. The monsters trigger specific discomforts. The music and silence manipulate tension. And the voice acting ensures that even human communication feels wrong and unsafe. Nothing in Silent Hill functions normally. Nothing feels right. The performances are part of that comprehensive wrongness, ensuring you never relax, never feel like you're on solid ground, never experience moment where nightmare logic suspends and normalcy returns. The performances nobody heard, meaning nobody heard them correctly, nobody understood what they were accomplishing, are doing vital work. They're creating dissociative atmosphere, reflecting character psychology, maintaining dreamlike wrongness, and ensuring that horror extends even to basic human interaction. Yes, the acting sounds strange. That's the point. In a town where nothing is right, where reality bends to psychological trauma, where monsters wear nurse uniforms and rust consumes architecture, why would speech be the one element that sounds normal? The performances are exactly as wrong as they need to be, serving horror through calculated strangeness that gets mistaken for incompetence but is actually sophisticated commitment to comprehensive atmospheric design. The mini payoff you've been waiting for. We're over 20 minutes deep into this exploration, and if you're still here, you deserve to go even darker. Because everything we've discussed, the fog, the rust, the helplessness, the radio, the silence, the monsters, the camera, the puzzles, the map, the endings, the town itself, the performances, all of it serves one ultimate purpose that ties Silent Hill's design philosophy together, forcing confrontation with guilt. Not generic guilt, not abstract moral failing, but specific, personal, unbearable guilt that characters carry and that the town refuses to let them escape. This is what separates Silent Hill from every other horror game. Resident Evil is about surviving biological threat. Dead Space is about surviving alien infestation. Amnesia is about surviving while helpless. These are external threats, dangers that exist independent of who you are internally. You could replace the protagonist with anyone and the horror would function identically. But Silent Hill doesn't work that way. The horror is specifically, deliberately, personally targeted at each protagonist's guilt, and removing that guilt means removing the horror itself. Harry Mason's guilt is complicated. He's not guilty of crime or deliberate harm, but throughout the game he's confronted with his failure to protect Cheryl, his inability to save her when she needed him most, his fundamental inadequacy as father. The town doesn't need to punish Harry for evil act. It punishes him for his sense of failure, for feeling he wasn't enough, for the guilt of being unable to prevent what happened. And by the end, he either earns redemption by saving what's left of his daughter, or he fails completely and walks away broken. The town measured his guilt and determined what he deserved. James Sunderland's guilt is more obvious and more horrific. He killed his wife, smothered her with a pillow. The entire nightmare of Silent Hill 2 exists because James cannot face this truth, because he's buried it so deeply beneath denial and false memories that he genuinely doesn't remember clearly what he did. The town forces him to remember, pieces his guilt back together through encountering Maria again and again, through fighting Pyramid Head, who represents his desire for punishment, through meeting Angela and Eddie, who reflect different responses to guilt and violence. By the end, James either accepts what he did and finds way forward, or he destroys himself because the guilt is unbearable. Every ending reflects different relationship with his guilt: acceptance, suicide, replacement, obsessive denial. The town gave him every opportunity to confront truth, and your ending reflects whether you helped him do so or enabled his denial. Heather Mason's guilt is inherited. She didn't choose to be Alessa reborn, didn't ask for the cult to pursue her, didn't want any of this, but she carries guilt anyway. Survivor's guilt for existing while Alessa suffered, guilt about violence she's forced to commit, guilt about bringing danger to people who try to help her. The town punishes her with manifestations of rage and violation and corrupted femininity because those are her traumas, her fears, her guilt about what was done to her and what she must do to survive. This focus on guilt as engine of horror is what makes Silent Hill psychologically sophisticated in ways other horror games rarely attempt. It's not enough to be chased by monsters. Those monsters have to mean something, have to represent something specific about your failures and shames. It's not enough to navigate dangerous environments. Those environments have to reflect your internal landscape, your guilt made architectural. It's not enough to reach an ending. That ending has to be earned through how you engaged with your guilt throughout the entire experience. And here's the uncomfortable part that makes Silent Hill so effective. The game makes you complicit. You control these guilty people. You make their decisions. You examine Mary's photo or you don't. You save Sybil or you don't. You play James as suicidal or as seeking redemption, and the game notices and responds. Your behavior determines what these characters deserve, what ending their guilt has earned. The town judges them, but through your hands. You're not distant observer watching someone else's guilt play out. You're actively participating in how that guilt manifests and resolves, and that participation makes it personal in ways that watching horror film or reading horror novel never quite achieves. This is the darkness beneath everything we've discussed. All the brilliant design choices, all the atmospheric techniques, all the sophisticated systems, they exist to serve this one goal: making guilt inescapable, making confrontation with personal failure mandatory, making horror emerge from internal damage rather than external threat. And once you understand this, you realize why Silent Hill hits differently than other horror games, why it lingers, why it makes people uncomfortable in ways that zombies and aliens never quite manage. Because zombies are easy, aliens are simple, guilt is hard. Guilt is what we actually fear, what keeps us awake at night, what we spend lives running from. And Silent Hill says, no more running, time to face what you've done, and we'll use every tool at our disposal to ensure you cannot look away. The permission to leave. We've walked through fog together for a long time now. We've examined mechanics and systems, design choices and atmospheric techniques, performances and endings, and the town that orchestrates it all. We've talked about what makes Silent Hill special, what design elements rarely get proper recognition, what sophisticated decisions hide beneath surface criticism. And if you've stayed this far, you understand now that Silent Hill isn't just horror game series. It's comprehensive exploration of guilt, trauma, and the impossibility of escape from our own psychological damage. The games we've discussed, primarily the first two with references to others, represent peak of what psychological horror in interactive medium can achieve. They don't rely on jump scares or gore. They build comprehensive atmospheric dread through dozens of interconnected design choices, all serving unified emotional purpose. The fog limits visibility, serving both technical necessity and psychological wrongness. The rust and blood and chain link communicate through visual language of decay and imprisonment. The helpless combat makes you feel vulnerable throughout. The radio transforms silence into threat. The actual silence weaponizes absence of sound. The monsters exploit specific bodily fears and psychological triggers. The camera judges and restricts and creates non-diegetic anxiety. The puzzles force engagement and create intellectual frustration. The map trusts your intelligence and allows genuine fear of being lost. The endings hurt because they're earned through accumulated behavior. The town itself is active participant reading your guilt and crafting personalized nightmare. And the performances maintain wrongness extending even to human speech. All of it works together. None of these elements function in isolation. They're components of comprehensive design philosophy that says horror should be personal, should emerge from character psychology, should force confrontation with uncomfortable truths, should respect player intelligence, should trust an atmosphere over spectacle, should prioritize sustained dread over temporary scares. This philosophy influenced countless games that followed, shaped how developers think about horror design, proved that video games could achieve psychological sophistication matching any other medium. But here's what nobody talks about enough: Silent Hill also gives you permission to leave. The games never force you to continue. You can stop playing, you can turn it off, you can walk away from the nightmare anytime. And for some people, that's the right choice. Silent Hill isn't for everyone. Its horror is too personal, too psychological, too focused on guilt and trauma and things people play games to escape from. And that's okay. The games themselves seem to understand this, offering joke endings that release pressure, offering multiple conclusions so if one feels too dark, you can play differently for another. They give you tools to control your experience, difficulty settings, puzzle complexity adjustments, the ability to fight less or more depending on what you can handle. The series gives you permission to leave, but it hopes you'll stay, hopes you'll engage with its darkness, confront its themes, walk through fog despite fear and discomfort, because on the other side of that confrontation is something valuable. Not resolution exactly, not comfort, but understanding. Understanding of why these damaged people do what they do, of how guilt operates, of how we build prisons for ourselves from our own failures and fears. And maybe, if you're very fortunate, understanding of your own relationship with these themes, seeing something of yourself reflected in Silent Hill.